It is July 25th, 2026, and 3 nights ago a single aircraft lifted off a runway in Gloucestershire, England, and civilian flight trackers followed it east until it vanished over the Mediterranean. Tail number 860108, a B-1B Lancer with the words "Aliens with Attitude" painted on the nose. It was not supposed to be traceable. It was traceable anyway because hobbyists with laptops and ADS-B receivers watched it climb out of RAF Fairford, cross-referenced the registry, and had the tail number circulating online before any government confirmed a thing. Within 24 hours, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps published a document, Public Relations Announcement Number 46, and buried inside it was a single sentence that reorganized this entire war. A British airbase on British soil, inside the home territory of a NATO member state, had been formally designated a legitimate military target by the Islamic Republic of Iran. Not a carrier in the Arabian Sea, not a forward base in Bahrain or Qatar or Jordan, a runway in the Cotswolds, 90 miles from central London. That is where this morning finds us. And the reason that sentence exists at all, the reason Iran is now threatening Europe instead of just threatening ships, is not the reason the headlines are giving you. The bombers are the symptom. What put those bombers over Fairford instead of over Diego Garcia is the actual story, and it is the part almost nobody is connecting. But let's back all the way up. Because to understand what just happened, you need to understand what has been building since the last week of February. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched simultaneous strikes across Iran under an operation the Pentagon named Epic Fury. This was not a warning shot. This was decapitation. Ali Khamenei, supreme leader of the Islamic Republic for 37 years, was killed. Ali Shamkhani, his senior security advisor and one of the most consequential strategic minds in the Iranian system, was killed. Mohammad Pakpour, Commander-in-Chief of the Revolutionary Guard, a man who had held that post for barely 8 months after his predecessor was killed in the June 2025 exchange, was killed. In a single night, the Islamic Republic lost its head of state, its security architect, the commander of its most powerful armed institution. And Iran responded with the one card it has held for 40 years without ever having to play it. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. Understand the geometry, because the geometry is the whole conflict. At its narrowest point, the strait is 21 miles across, and the deep water shipping channels inside it are narrower still, 2 miles wide inbound, 2 miles wide outbound, separated by a 2-mile buffer. Roughly a quarter of all seaborne crude oil on Earth passes through that gap. Roughly a fifth of the world's liquefied natural gas. There is no alternate route. There's no bypass pipeline with meaningful capacity. There is one door, and Iran sits on the northern hinge of it with 300 miles of mountainous coastline, dozens of small ports, hundreds of fast attack craft, and a coastal missile inventory built over 3 decades for exactly this scenario. The IRGC began transmitting on VHF radio to every vessel in the waterway. No ship was permitted to pass. On March the 2nd, they refined it. Closed to unfriendly nations, open only to vessels Iran itself approved. By March 4th, the regular Iranian Navy was integrated into the enforcement. Then came the mines. Then came the boardings. Then came the drones flying into the sides of merchant hulls in the middle of the night with no warning and no declaration. The Royal Navy issued a legal assessment that Iran's closure had no standing in international law, which was correct and completely irrelevant, because insurers do not read legal assessments. They read loss reports. War risk premiums for Gulf transits detonated. Charterers stopped booking. Ships turned around mid-voyage and sat in Fujairah and Sohar waiting for someone to tell them the water was safe. Global fuel prices went vertical. On March 19th, the United States opened an air campaign specifically aimed at reopening the strait. Not at Iran's nuclear program, at its anti-shipping architecture, coastal radar, surveillance sites, missile batteries, drone storage, small boat concentrations. On March 11th, alone before the campaign was formally named, American forces destroyed 16 Iranian boats identified as laying naval mines. In a later single wave, more than 60 small craft belonging to the Guard were struck. And here's where it gets significantly worse for Tehran. On April 13th, the United States did not just bomb Iran, it blockaded it. American warships sealed Iranian ports and cut off the oil exports that fund the entire Iranian state. For 6 weeks, April 13th to May 29th, the Islamic Republic's revenue engine was physically switched off by naval force. That is the pressure that produced the negotiation. Not goodwill, not diplomacy for its own sake. A blockade. On April 8th, Pakistan announced that Washington and Tehran had agreed to a 2-week pause. Islamabad became the venue. Vice President J.D. Vance flew into the Pakistani capital and sat across from Iranian officials with Field Marshal Asim Munir brokering the room. 2 months of grinding stop-start negotiation followed. On June 12th, Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif announced that both sides had agreed on final text. On June 14th, representatives digitally signed it. On June 17th, President Trump signed the memorandum during dinner with Emmanuel Macron at the Palace of Versailles, hours after the G7. And Masoud Pezeshkian signed it remotely from Tehran. 14 points. It became known as the Islamabad Memorandum, and this is the document that explains every single thing that has happened since, because of what it contained, and far more importantly, because of what it deliberately did not. Go through it, point by point. Because the mainstream coverage in June treated this as a peace deal, and it was not a peace deal. It was a two-phase structure in which Phase 1 was real, and Phase 2 was a promise. Phase 1, an immediate halt to military strikes. The Strait of Hormuz reopened to commercial shipping. The American naval blockade of Iranian ports lifted. A 60-day extension of the ceasefire during which negotiators would attempt to convert the framework into something permanent. Economic incentives dangled in front of Tehran, including a broad waiver on oil sanctions, and a pathway toward the release of Iranian funds frozen abroad. Funds Iran had specifically demanded in a 14-point settlement proposal of its own back in May, asking for $24 billion unfrozen, half of it up front on signature. Now here is what was not in it. There was no accord on Iran's nuclear program. None. No enrichment ceiling, no stockpile transfer, no inspection regime. The memorandum contained language calling for the downgrading of Iranian uranium from weapons grade to reactor grade, but only following a final agreement that did not exist and does not exist today. The most consequential issue in the entire 47-year confrontation was written down as a thing to be discussed later. And the language on the strait itself, the actual reason the war started, was worse. Iran did not commit to keeping Hormuz open. Iran committed to using its best efforts for the safe passage of commercial vessels. Best efforts. That is the phrasing of a contractor explaining why the kitchen will not be finished on time, and it was placed at the load-bearing center of a war termination agreement. Then came the clause that mattered most, and almost no one read it carefully in June. Safe passage, with no charge, for 60 days only. For 60 days only. Read that again, because it matters more than anything else in the document. The memorandum did not establish that the Strait of Hormuz is international water, through which vessels transit freely as a matter of law, which it is. The memorandum established that Iran would waive charges for 60 days, which means the memorandum implicitly conceded in writing, signed by the President of the United States at a dinner table in Versailles, that after 60 days there might be something to charge for. It did not rule out what Iranian officials would later call service fees. It created in the negative space of a single subordinate clause an Iranian right to toll the world's most important waterway. And Tehran read that clause exactly the way you would expect a regime fighting for institutional survival to read it. Within weeks, Iran stood up an entirely new bureaucratic entity, the Persian Gulf Strait Authority. Vessels were to register with it, crews were to be vetted, cargo manifests were to be submitted, and traffic was to be routed not through the southern channel along the Omani coast that the United States and the international shipping community use, but through a corridor hugging the Iranian shoreline, inside the engagement envelope of every coastal battery Iran still possesses. That is not a customs office. That is a sovereignty claim with a letterhead. Iran did not need to break the memorandum to close the strait. Iran needed only to administer it. There's one more thing the memorandum did not do, and it is the detail that explains the speed of the collapse. Iran's supreme leader did not sign it. Mojtaba Khamenei, elected by the 88-member Assembly of Experts after his father's death, issued a written statement endorsing the memorandum, while openly stating he held a different view from President Pezeshkian and had misgivings. He signed off because Pezeshkian gave him assurances that the rights of the Iranian nation and of what Tehran calls the resistance front would be protected. An agreement the head of state endorses reluctantly in writing is not an agreement. It is a receipt. 8 days after Versailles, on June 25th, an Iranian drone struck a cargo ship transiting the Strait of Hormuz. No casualties, no serious damage. A scratch on a hull in the scheme of what this war has already done. And that scratch ended the peace. What followed was a pattern that repeated until it broke. Iran hits commercial shipping. The United States retaliates with limited strikes. Iran retaliates against American allies in the Gulf, Bahrain, Kuwait, and everyone resets one rung higher than before. Each cycle removed another pillar from the memorandum. By the time Trump stood on the sidelines of the NATO summit and declared the ceasefire finished, calling his Iranian counterparts scum and sick people, the United States was striking 90 targets in a night and expanding the geographic scope of the campaign into the southern and northeastern reaches of the country. Iran's foreign ministry said American munitions had hit 2 bridges. Then came July 11th, and the moment the pretense died. The IRGC opened fire on a Cyprus-flagged container ship in the strait. 1 crew member missing. The guard's account was that it had fired a warning shot at a vessel using an unauthorized route. meaning a vessel that had used the internationally recognized southern channel instead of the corridor Iran's new Strait Authority had designated. And then the IRGC Navy said the words out loud again, 4.5 months after the first time. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. The American response was 140 Iranian military targets in a single round, the third round that week alone. And from that night forward, CENTCOM struck Iran every single night for 13 consecutive nights. Here is exactly where things stand as of this morning, in hard numbers, and every one of these figures is confirmed rather than estimated. More than 50,000 American service members are currently operating across the Middle East, per Central Command's own repeated statements. The Wall Street Journal has reported a surge in specialist medical personnel, including 150 additional medics at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, the primary receiving hospital for American casualties out of that theater. You do not surge trauma capacity at Landstuhl because you expect a quiet fortnight. Since early May, CENTCOM states it has facilitated the transit of approximately 900 commercial vessels and 450 million barrels of crude oil through the strait under military escort. That number is the reason the global economy has not seized entirely. It is also the reason the American commitment cannot be quietly wound down. 900 hulls have crossed that water because United States warships were standing between them and the Iranian coast. On the 12th consecutive night of strikes, American munitions hit the passenger terminal at the Shalamcheh border crossing with Iraq. 2 people were killed. Iran says civilian infrastructure has been struck repeatedly. The United States says it is targeting military capability. Both statements can be simultaneously true, and in a campaign of this tempo, they usually are. On the 13th night, Thursday, July 23rd, concluding at 9 in the evening Eastern Time, CENTCOM published its target list, and the composition of that list is the single most underanalyzed fact of this entire week. For the first time in the July campaign, the list led with Iranian military command centers and communications networks. Drone storage facilities, coastal surveillance sites, and maritime capabilities followed. For 12 nights, the emphasis had been on the things that shoot at ships. On night 13, the emphasis moved to the things that tell those weapons what to shoot at. That is not an escalation in volume. That is a change in theory. 12 nights of attrition against launchers, then a pivot to the nervous system that coordinates them. The human cost on the American side has been steadily minimized in public and is worse than the headlines suggest. 3 American service members have been killed in recent weeks. Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell confirmed that nearly 100 service members sustained some degree of injury since July 7th, while stressing that 96% returned to duty and that the overwhelming majority were minor concussions. He published that specifically to push back on a New York Times report alleging the Pentagon had withheld dozens of injury figures. Note what is being argued about, not whether there were casualties, whether they were disclosed. The Iranian toll is far heavier and far murkier. Iranian authorities put the July resumption alone at a minimum of 50 killed and more than 500 wounded as of July 18th. Cumulative Iranian claims since February 28th exceed 3,000 dead, including 168 children. The Human Rights Monitor, RANA's standing count is 3,636, 1,221 military, 1,701 civilian, 714 unclassified. Iran's own Foundation of Martyrs confirms 3,468. American and Israeli estimates place the total at 6,000 or higher, with injury figures ranging from 15,000 on the Western estimate to 26,500, according to Iran's health ministry. And in the water itself, 1 tugboat sunk, at least 17 merchant ships damaged, 7 of them abandoned by their crews, 2 merchant vessels captured outright, 12 seafarers killed or missing, 1 port worker killed and 2 wounded in Bahrain, a country that is not a combatant, whose only offense was proximity, 12 merchant sailors, civilians on commercial hulls carrying other people's cargo, who had no stake in the Islamic Republic's nuclear program or America's strategic posture, and who are dead because a state decided a shipping lane was a weapon. Now, let's talk about the thing that happened on Thursday, because it is being reported as a financial story, and it is not a financial story. It is the removal of the last piece of leverage Tehran believed it still held. President Trump posted on Truth Social that from that point forward, any and all damages done to ships, cargo, or anything related thereto would be paid for by Iranian money in the possession and control of the United States. He acknowledged the damages might be, in his phrasing, very substantial, and described the measure as the fair and equitable thing to do. He asked that the statement stand as policy until further notice. Take that apart clause by clause, because each one is doing separate work. Iranian money that the United States has in its possession and controls. Tehran has somewhere near $100 billion in assets frozen across various jurisdictions and beyond its reach. The portion actually held under direct American control is far smaller. Reporting puts the cash figure in the low billions. So the dollar amount is not the point. The precedent is the point. From this point forth, perspective, open-ended, no ceiling, no sunset. Any and all damages done to ships, cargo, or anything related thereto. Not damage to American warships. Not combat losses incurred by the United States Navy in the course of the escort operation. Commercial damage, third-party damage, the Greek-owned tanker, the Cyprus-flagged container ship, the Japanese charterer, the Gulf port that took a drone. Iran's own account is now the insurance fund for the harm Iran inflicts on people who are not party to this fight. Until further notice, a policy declared by social media post, which means it can be modified by social media post, which means the negotiating value is preserved. And here is the mechanism that makes this land harder than any bomb dropped in 13 nights. Those frozen funds were the sweetener inside the Islamabad Memorandum. They were the thing Iran wanted most, the thing Tehran had itemized in its own May proposal, the thing the Qataris and other intermediaries had been working to move into accounts the Islamic Republic could actually spend from. Progress had reportedly been made on the first tranche. That money was not a distant abstraction to the men running Iran. It was a plan. It was the bridge across an economy strangled by 6 weeks of naval blockade and 5 months of war. Thursday's post did not seize money Iran was using. It killed the plan Iran was counting on. It converted an asset Tehran expected to receive into a liability that grows every time the IRGC fires at a hull, which is why the response tells you more than the post did. Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi went to X on Friday and wrote that seizing another nation's assets to pay for unrelated future claims sets an incendiary precedent. He warned that those who celebrate or profit from such funds should remember that once governments normalize confiscation, no one's assets are safe. He added that the ensuing chaos would not be pretty or peaceful. Read that carefully. Because Araghchi is a professional, and professionals do not accidentally choose their audience. That post is not addressed to Washington. Washington does not care whether Iran finds the precedent incendiary. That post is addressed to every sovereign wealth fund, every central bank reserve manager, and every finance ministry in the developing world that holds dollar-denominated assets and has spent the last 4 years watching Russian reserves get immobilized and Venezuelan energy exports get taken over. Araghchi is not appealing to law. He's attempting to convert an Iranian problem into a systemic one, to make the seizure of Iranian money a threat to Chinese money, Indian money, Gulf money, so that pressure on Washington arrives from directions Washington cannot bomb. It is a genuinely sophisticated move. It is also an admission. You only reach for the systemic argument when the bilateral one is gone. And there was a second Araghchi post, the day before, that revealed considerably more than he intended. He wrote that compromised individuals in the American administration were burying their heads in the sand, ignoring realities on the ground, and appeared focused only on 2028, and that the aggression they advocate would ensure the president pays a heavier price for the deal he is trying to achieve. Look at what that concedes. Not that Trump wants war, that Trump is trying to achieve a deal, and that hardliners around him are the obstacle. Iran's chief diplomat in public on the 5th month of a war is arguing that the American president is the reasonable actor, and his advisors are the problem. That is the argument of a government that wants a settlement and is trying to find someone in Washington to give it one, while simultaneously being unable to admit at home that it needs one. And that brings us to the platform in the sky, because the aircraft over Fairford is not just a delivery system. It is a message with wings, and the message it carries is one the Pentagon would rather you did not decode. The B-1B Lancer is a supersonic long-range bomber originally designed to penetrate Soviet airspace at low altitude. It is not stealthy. It was never meant to be. The B-2 and B-21 carry that mission. What the B-1 carries is payload, the largest conventional weapons capacity in the United States inventory, up to 24 cruise missiles in its 3 internal bays, delivered from standoff range hundreds of miles from the target. It refuels in flight, which means its combat radius is limited by crew endurance and tanker availability rather than fuel. 146 feet of airframe designed around a single question. How much ordnance can we put on a target from very far away? Very fast. Now ask the question the coverage is not asking. Why is that aircraft flying from England? Iran's own answer, published in that July 23rd IRGC statement, is that American naval cruise missile stockpiles supporting the Indian Ocean flotilla had been depleted, forcing Washington to shift its strike architecture toward land-based long-range bombers. That is an Iranian claim from an information operation, and it should be treated as exactly that. But the important point is not whether the claim is true. The important point is what it would mean if it were. Shipborne Tomahawk and air-launched JASSM inventories are finite, and they are consumed at a rate no peacetime replenishment plan ever modeled against 13 consecutive nights of strikes across 5 months. Every night, CENTCOM publishes a target list, magazines somewhere get shallower. A destroyer with an empty vertical launch cell array is a very expensive radar. If the campaign has genuinely reached the point where naval standoff weapons must be supplemented by bombers staging out of Europe, then the constraint on American operations has quietly stopped being political will and started being industrial capacity. And that would explain the choice of Fairford over the alternative. The United States has an ideal bomber base for Iran operations already. Diego Garcia, the joint British-American facility in the Chagos Archipelago, 3,800 kilometers from Iranian territory, used for exactly this purpose in every regional contingency for 4 decades. B-2s deployed there earlier in this conflict, so did B-1s. The problem is that Iran attempted to strike Diego Garcia with ballistic missiles in March. 2 launches. The attempt failed. Tehran denied responsibility while its state media had spent weeks openly threatening the base, and Iranian planners appear to have concluded the failure was one of accuracy rather than range, which is precisely why Iranian Aerospace Force voices are now floating a ballistic missile strike against Fairford itself, potentially using cluster munitions to compensate for the circular error probable their March attempt exposed. Sit with the engineering logic in that, because it is chilling in its ordinariness. We cannot hit the runway precisely, so we will use a warhead that does not need to be precise. Submunitions across a wide footprint do not need to strike the aiming point. They need to strike parked aircraft, fuel bowsers, ordnance dollies, and ground crew. Against a hardened bunker, cluster munitions are nearly useless. Against a bomber sitting on an apron in Gloucestershire, they are close to ideal. The delivery systems Iranian state media has itemized for this class of mission are the newer variants of the Khorramshahr intermediate-range ballistic missile and the Shahed 136B, a loitering munition with an advertised range of 4,000 kilometers. Whether those systems can actually reach the English Midlands with useful accuracy after 5 months of American strikes on Iranian launch infrastructure is a serious open question. Whether Tehran believes it needs to succeed in order to achieve the political effect is a different question entirely, and the answer to that one is no. The Americans, notably, are not treating the threat as rhetorical. EA-37B Compass Call aircraft have arrived at RAF Fairford. That platform is an electronic attack asset. It jams, degrades, and blinds command and control and air defense networks. Its arrival at the same base Iran has just threatened is not a coincidence, and it points toward 2 simultaneous conclusions: that the B-1 operation out of England is expected to continue and expand, and that someone in the planning cells has thought carefully about the survivability of the aircraft on that ramp. A British government spokesman said the armed forces stand ready to keep the United Kingdom safe from attacks on its soil or from abroad, and that the UK stands ready around the clock to defend itself. Officials stressed the layered nature of British air and missile defense, Royal Navy vessels, Army units, RAF assets integrated with NATO, while insisting Britain is not being drawn into the wider conflict. Both halves of that statement cannot be true. You do not describe your integrated air and missile defense posture in response to a question about a war you're not part of. And that is the second thing the coverage is getting wrong. This is being reported as Iran threatening Britain. What actually happened is that Britain changed its policy and Iran responded. Sir Keir Starmer initially refused to allow American aircraft to operate against Iran from British soil, a refusal that produced open friction with Washington. Trump said he was not happy with the United Kingdom and complained that American aircraft were flying many extra hours as a result. Starmer eventually shifted under Allied pressure in March, authorizing use of British bases for strikes on Iranian missile sites attacking shipping in Hormuz, framed as collective self-defense of the region. His successor, Andy Burnham, has now recommitted to that agreement and moved faster than his predecessor did. Iran noticed the difference. Araghchi's formulation was that any party contributing to the aggression, whatever the kind of support, would also be considered a legitimate target, and he promised retaliation on an eye-for-an-eye basis. Iran's foreign ministry issued its own statement alongside the Guards, condemning the decision on British bases, calling London a principal architect of regional instability, and running back through the grievance list. The 1953 coup, British support for Iraq during the 80s war, nuclear sanctions, the prescription of the IRGC. That is not improvisation. That is a prepared file, held for the moment it became useful. So look at what is actually converging on Tehran right now, because there are 3 separate tracks, and they are all arriving in the same 72-hour window. That simultaneity is the entire point, and it is producing an effect none of the 3 could produce alone. The financial track. Frozen assets converted from a promised incentive into a compensation fund for damage Iran causes. The oil sanctions waiver that was dangled in the memorandum, now dead alongside it. A blockade posture the Navy has demonstrated it can reimpose at will. American forces disabled an empty tanker attempting to bypass the blockade of Iranian ports this week, and disabled another running toward Karg Island, the terminal, that is the single most important node in Iran's export economy. Tehran's route back to solvency ran through that memorandum. And the memorandum is ash. The military track, 13 consecutive nights, 50,000 personnel in theater, a target list that shifted on night 13 from launchers to command centers and communications, meaning American planners have moved from degrading Iran's ability to shoot toward degrading Iran's ability to decide. Bombers now operating from 2 continents, and a president publicly stating that Israel could join a broader operation immediately, while adding that the United States does not need anybody. The psychological track, and this is the one being executed most precisely. Rubio, speaking to reporters on the sidelines of the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting in Manila on Thursday, said, Iran is begging Washington both directly and indirectly for a deal, for talks. He said the problem is that every time Iran makes a deal, the people in charge either break it or want to change it. And then he said the sentence that is doing the real work. It looks like they are not ready to make a deal, so they are going to continue to pay a price, and every night the price gets higher. Rubio also described American policy in this phase as a head for an eye, not proportionality. Escalation dominance stated openly by the Secretary of State in front of cameras in an allied capital. And then Trump himself, on Thursday, told reporters he is considering a massive attack, bigger than anything before, and that he is close to making a decision and is all set for it. Now watch what happened on Friday. For 13 consecutive nights, Central Command had posted to X announcing strikes on Iran. On Friday, Eastern Time, that post did not come. There was no announcement. Trump met with advisors on Iran options that same day. Iran's army, meanwhile, conducted drone strikes against American military facilities in Bahrain and Jordan. And the IDF identified missiles launched from Iran toward Aqaba. IRNA reported 4 killed and 5 injured in the area of Ahvaz, so the shooting did not stop. But the ritual announcement stopped. After 13 nights of publishing target categories at 9 in the evening, the pattern broke. In the same 24 hours, the president said he was close to a decision on something much larger. That silence is either a pause for diplomacy or a pause for preparation, and nobody outside a very small number of rooms currently knows which brings us to the question that actually determines what happens next. And it is not what Washington decides. It is who in Tehran is capable of deciding anything. Mojtaba Khamenei is Supreme Leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. He was elected by the Assembly of Experts after his father's death. He was also, by all serious accounts, severely wounded in the same February 28th strike that killed his father. Reporting indicates severe burns to his face and lips that have made speaking difficult, along with significant leg and hand injuries. Senior Iranian officials describe him as mentally sharp and engaged. He is being kept hidden, in large part out of fear that Israel would attempt to kill him too. A theocracy whose entire constitutional logic runs through the voice of one man now has a supreme leader who has difficulty speaking and cannot appear in public. So authority has been delegated, and it has been delegated to a committee that does not formally exist. Analysts tracking the Iranian system describe power distributed across the Revolutionary Guard, the judiciary, and the parliament, with no single individual calling the shots. The institution doing the coordinating is the Supreme National Security Council, which lost its own chairman, Ali Larijani, the most formidable political operator in the Iranian establishment, and Khamenei's longtime confidant, to an Israeli strike in March. The acting commander-in-chief of the IRGC is Brigadier General Ahmad Vahidi. Understand who that is. Vahidi was the founding commander of the Quds Force, the expeditionary and covert action arm that built Iran's entire regional proxy network. He has held senior intelligence and operational posts throughout the Guard. He served as Iran's Minister of Defense and later Minister of Interior. He is a hardliner by every assessment, and he is running the IRGC in an acting capacity, because the man appointed to run it was killed in February. The public voice of Iranian authority has become Mohammad Bagher Kalibaf, Speaker of Parliament, himself a former Revolutionary Guard commander. Kalibaf is not filling a constitutional role. He is functioning as the go-between among the factions that now control Iran, and he holds that position because he retains a substantial base of support among the Guard and among conservative constituencies, and because he is one of the very few remaining senior officials with strong ties to the cohort the previous Supreme Leader trusted. And the IRGC intelligence organization? Its director, Majid Kademi, was killed by airstrike on April 6th. The position is listed as vacant. So assemble the actual chain of command as it exists this morning. A Supreme Leader who cannot speak easily and cannot be seen, a National Security Council whose chairman is dead, an IRGC commanded on an acting basis by a former Quds Force founder, an intelligence directorate with no director, a parliamentary speaker acting as broker among factions, and an elected president who signed a memorandum his Supreme Leader endorsed only reluctantly and in writing. Trump's own characterization in a recent interview was that the Iranians are all messed up and have no idea who their leader is. There is something worse than that, and it is the thing that should genuinely worry you. When the IRGC Navy declared the Strait of Hormuz closed on July 11th and fired on a Cyprus-flagged container ship, was that a decision made at the top of the Iranian state? Or was it made by a naval commander in Bandar Abbas, applying the Persian Gulf Strait Authority's registration rules to a vessel he judged to be on an unauthorized route, with no functioning process above him capable of asking whether closing the strait that afternoon served Iran's strategic interest? Because those are radically different situations with radically different implications, and the honest answer is that outside observers cannot currently tell them apart. The Guard has spent 5 months being decapitated at the senior level, while retaining thousands of junior and mid-level officers with launch authority, coastal batteries, drone stocks, and standing rules of engagement issued by men who are now dead. That is the assessment, stripped of both governments' framing. The United States has comprehensively dismantled Iran's conventional capacity. Trump told the White House Correspondents' Dinner audience on Friday that Iran no longer has Navy or Air Force capabilities and has very few drones left despite what people see. On the conventional balance sheet, that is closer to true than not. Iran's Navy is wreckage, its Air Force was never a factor, its air defenses have been methodically stripped, and its senior command has been killed repeatedly. And none of that has reopened the Strait of Hormuz on a permanent basis. Vice President Vance, who has led the American diplomatic effort, said it plainly, and his candor deserves attention precisely because it cuts against his own administration's messaging. You can bomb them, he said. You can take away their radar, their drones, some of their missiles. But it is simply too easy to fire at ships in the straits. So you have to actually be willing to talk and try to figure out the problem. That is the strategic reality that 13 nights of strikes cannot change. The asymmetry does not resolve through attrition. A 21-mile waterway with a mountainous, hostile coastline can be interdicted by a man with a shoulder-launched weapon and a pickup truck. It can be interdicted by one drone in a shipping container. It can be interdicted by a mine that costs less than the missile fired at the boat that laid it. Iran does not need a navy to close Hormuz. Iran needs coastline, and no bombing campaign in history has removed a coastline, which is why CENTCOM's own language has quietly settled on a formulation that admits this. The strait, it says, remains open for transit despite recent attacks. Not secured, not reopened. Remains open because 900 vessels have been walked through it by American warships since May, one convoy at a time. That is not a resolution. That is a subsidy, paid indefinitely by the United States Navy, and it is the position the Islamic Republic has actually achieved. The rest of the region is noticing. A senior Arab official directly involved in diplomatic efforts told NBC News this week in 5 words, "What months of communiques have not? It is only getting crazier." Gulf states that supported the objective of reopening the strait are absorbing the retaliation for it. Drones over Bahrain, missiles toward Jordan, a dead port worker in Manama. Saudi Arabia has now launched strikes against the Houthis after another Saudi-linked vessel was attacked in the Red Sea, opening a second maritime front, with Rubio arguing that the Houthis were snookered by Iran into targeting Saudi shipping after staying out of direct involvement earlier. So here is the one thing that keeps serious analysts awake, and it is not the massive attack Trump is weighing. It is that Iran no longer has a functioning mechanism for climbing down. De-escalation is not a feeling. It is an administrative act. It requires a leadership able to issue an order, transmit it through a chain of command, and have thousands of dispersed units with standing engagement authority actually obey. Iran has been systematically stripped of every layer of that machinery. The supreme leader is wounded and hidden. The Security Council's chairman is dead. The IRGC commander is an acting appointee. The intelligence director's chair is empty. Authority is being exercised by an informal committee whose only demonstrated shared objective is regime survival. Which means that even if Tehran decided tonight to accept every American term, and Rubio says Tehran is begging for talks, and Araghchi is publicly arguing that Trump wants a deal, the Islamic Republic may not be structurally capable of delivering the quiet on the water that any agreement would require. One coastal commander applying the Strait Authority's rules to the wrong ship on the wrong afternoon can collapse a settlement built over months, exactly as June 25th collapsed Versailles. And now a NATO member's home territory has been named as a target. If a single Iranian submunition lands on that apron in Gloucestershire, even a failed attempt, even one intercepted over the North Sea, the conversation in Brussels changes overnight from regional maritime security to collective defense, and it changes in a direction from which no participant can reverse. That threshold does not require anyone to decide to cross it. It requires only one launch by one officer in a command structure that no longer has a functioning brake. 3 nights ago, a B-1B with the words "Aliens with Attitude" painted on its nose rolled down a runway in Gloucestershire, and a group of civilians with radio receivers watched it go and wrote down its tail number, 860108. Yesterday, there was no strike announcement from Central Command for the first time in 14 days. The president said he is close to a decision on something bigger than anything yet attempted. The Secretary of State said Iran is begging. Iran's foreign minister said the ensuing chaos will not be pretty or peaceful. And on that same runway in England, electronic warfare aircraft have arrived to protect the bombers from a country that has just declared the ground beneath them a legitimate target. Somewhere in Tehran, a man who cannot speak clearly is being briefed on all of it in a room whose location almost nobody knows by a committee that does not officially exist. And nobody, not in Washington, not in Islamabad, not in Brussels, and quite possibly not in Tehran, can tell you tonight who has the authority to stop this. If this breakdown gave you something the headlines did not, subscribe, because what happens in the next 72 hours is going to matter for a very long time.